Belarus is the only former Soviet republic that never fully privatized its economy, the only one that never joined NATO or the EU or applied for membership, the only one with the same leader it has had since 1994. Alexander Lukashenko was elected president of Belarus 30 years ago on a platform of anti-corruption and Soviet nostalgia. He has governed ever since, through constitutional changes that eliminated term limits, through elections that Western governments uniformly describe as fraudulent, and through a model of state-directed economic management that most economists said would fail within a decade. GDP per capita in Belarus today is $8,000, higher than Ukraine, higher than Moldova, higher than most of Central Asia. The data immediately raises a question. How does a country that refused to reform, refused to privatize, and refused to integrate with Western institutions outperform many of its neighbors that tried to do all three? The answer is complicated, and the data tells you both why Belarus appears to be succeeding and why it is not. Belarus inherited something that most former Soviet republics did not: finished industry. The Belarusian SSR was the Soviet Union's assembly workshop. Tractors, trucks, refrigerators, televisions, machine tools, Belarus made them. The factories were large, relatively modern by Soviet standards, and integrated into supply chains that stretched across the entire Union. When the USSR dissolved, those supply chains broke, but the physical assets remained in better condition than in many other republics. Lukashenko's decision not to privatize those factories meant that they remained state property, continued operating with state subsidies, and preserved employment. This was economically inefficient by market standards. Many of those enterprises would not survive in a competitive market without subsidies, but it prevented the catastrophic unemployment spike that devastated parts of Ukraine and Russia during transition. Belarus in the 1990s had unemployment below 5%, while its neighbors saw double-digit unemployment. Social stability was maintained, at the cost of economic modernization. The Lukashenko model has a specific and clearly documented mechanism: Russian energy subsidies. Russia has provided Belarus with natural gas and oil at prices significantly below market rates, with the margin between the subsidized price Belarus pays and the global market price functioning as an effective cash transfer from Moscow to Minsk. Economists who have studied this transfer estimate its annual value at between $3 and $6 billion, representing somewhere between 8 and 15% of Belarus's GDP in different years. To put that in concrete terms, the Russian subsidy to Belarus is of comparable magnitude to the total foreign aid received by Ukraine from Western governments in some pre-war years. Belarus has been running a hidden subsidy economy while appearing to be self-sufficient. When that subsidy is included in the analysis, Belarus's actual economic performance is significantly weaker than the GDP headline suggests. The country has been reselling Russian oil at market prices, buying cheap from Russia, refining it, and selling at global prices to European customers, and the difference between buy price and sell price has been one of the primary sources of Belarusian export revenue. That model requires continued Russian subsidy to function, and since 2020, the political and economic terms of that subsidy have shifted significantly in Russia's favor. The 2020 presidential election in Belarus triggered the largest protest movement in the country's history. Lukashenko claimed victory with over 80% of the vote. Independent observers, exit polls, and widespread documented evidence of ballot fraud suggested that the actual result was likely the opposite. What followed was months of mass protests that drew hundreds of thousands of people. The state response was brutal: mass arrests, documented torture, forced disappearances, and the flight of opposition leaders, including Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who relocated to Lithuania and began operating as a government in exile recognized by Western democratic governments. The economic consequences were immediate. The European Union and United States imposed sanctions targeting Belarusian state enterprises, Belarusian potash exports, which represent a significant share of global supply, and specific individuals in the Lukashenko government. Belarus's potash industry, one of its few genuinely globally competitive sectors, lost access to Western markets. GDP contracted in 2020 and partially recovered in 2021 and 2022 as Russian economic support increased to compensate. But the structural vulnerability that the 2020 crisis exposed has not been resolved. It has deepened. Belarus's dependency on Russia increased dramatically after 2020. Russia provided emergency financing. Russian companies bought Belarusian exports that Western markets refused. The political price was clear. Belarus's foreign policy became entirely subordinated to Russian interests. Belarus allowed Russian forces to use its territory as a staging ground for the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, making Belarus a de facto participant in the war and triggering a second, more comprehensive wave of Western sanctions. The economic data from 2022 onward shows Belarus increasingly becoming an economic satellite of Russia rather than an independent economy. Trade with Russia increased from roughly 50% of total trade to over 70%. Western markets are effectively closed. Belarusian exports to the EU, which had been growing, collapsed. The country is being economically absorbed by Russia at an accelerating rate. Whether that absorption is a strategic choice by Lukashenko or an outcome he was forced into by the 2020 political crisis is a question that historians will debate. The data shows the result is the same either way. What happens to Belarus if Russia's economy deteriorates significantly? This is the scenario that Belarusian economists in exile consistently identify as the existential risk. Belarus has no foreign currency reserves of its own sufficient to sustain its economy without Russian support. Its industry depends on Russian raw material inputs. Its export market is dominated by Russia. Its energy supply depends on Russian gas at subsidized rates. A scenario in which Russia's war-related economic deterioration forces Moscow to end or reduce subsidies to Belarus would hit the Belarusian economy harder and faster than any Western sanctions package. The $8,000 GDP per capita figure is real, but it is built on a foundation that could be removed by decisions made in Moscow rather than Minsk. 3 trajectories are possible by 2030. A genuine political transition toward the West, unlikely while Lukashenko remains in power, but not impossible if succession becomes a crisis, could lead to sanctions removal, EU association, and a growth trajectory similar to Ukraine's pre-2022 path. A continuation of the current model requires sustained Russian subsidy, which Russia may be unable or unwilling to provide indefinitely. Gradual economic absorption into Russia would preserve some stability, but at the cost of sovereignty that the 2020 protests showed millions of Belarusians still care deeply about. Subscribe to the Collapse Index. New data every week.